In the shadows of New York City, Elijah Carter, a former government assassin, has disappeared into homelessness, hiding from a past filled with bloodshed. But when a corrupt cop pushes him too far, the predator awakens. Now, with nothing left to lose, Elijah will stop at nothing to bring down the criminal empire that betrayed him. Can one man take on a whole network of power and corruption? The hunt is on, and the stakes have never been higher. If you're hooked, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because you won't want to miss what happens next in this gripping battle for redemption. Elijah Carter sat still under the flickering glow of a street lamp, the cold rain pelting his worn jacket, soaking him to the bone. His hands gripped a paper cup of coffee that had long since lost its warmth, but he didn't care. The rain's rhythmic drumming against the pavement had always calmed him, sharpening his focus. His eyes, dark and calculating, scanned the street, taking in every detail, every nervous glance, every hasty step. He was always watching, always aware. The years spent in the shadows had honed him into something more than just a man. He was a weapon, but nobody knew it. Not anymore. New York streets, filled with the hum of late-night traffic and the constant shuffle of pedestrians, were oblivious to the silent danger that lingered in their midst. Elijah's life had been reduced to this, hiding in plain sight, lost among the faceless crowd. The city had forgotten him, and he had made peace with it. At least, that's what he told himself. The sound of a car's tires splashing through the puddles broke his concentration. A patrol car, its red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement, rolled to a stop just in front of the diner. Elijah didn't move. He didn't blink. He knew exactly who was stepping out of that car before they even opened the door. Officer Boone, the lead officer, was tall, broad-shouldered, and exuded the kind of arrogance that came with authority and unchecked power. Elijah had crossed paths with men like him before, in the dark corners of the world where justice was a joke, and the law was whatever they wanted it to be. Boone was surrounded by 3 other officers, all of them in uniform, looking as if they were on the hunt for something or someone. Elijah wasn't concerned. He had survived worse. But the question lingered. Why were they here? He hadn't done anything to draw their attention, not directly anyway. But there was something about the way Boone looked at him as he walked toward the diner that made Elijah's blood run cold. The officer's eyes gleamed with that all-too-familiar smugness, the one that said, "I own this place." "You know," Boone's voice cut through the air, his tone lazy as he sauntered closer to Elijah. "This spot's not a hotel, old-timer." Elijah didn't respond. He didn't even look at Boone. His gaze was fixed on a distant point beyond the officer, a small detail that irritated Boone more than it should have. Boone was used to being the center of attention, not ignored. He jabbed his baton into Elijah's side, the metal clicking against the wet pavement. "I'm talking to you," Boone barked, his voice sharp now. His hand fell to his baton with a casual ease, a subtle threat. He expected a reaction, anger, fear, something that would justify the escalation he was already planning. Elijah's voice was calm, measured, and without fear. "Neither, sir." Boone froze, taken aback for a moment. He glanced at his partners, exchanging looks of mild confusion. The younger officer, who had been trailing behind, shifted uncomfortably on his feet. "We got a smart one, huh?" Boone laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. He leaned closer, his face twisting into something more menacing. "What's in the bag, huh?" Boone asked, kicking at the worn duffel bag by Elijah's feet. "Booze? Drugs? Or just personal junk?" "Personal items," Elijah replied evenly. "Nothing illegal." Boone's eyes narrowed. There was something about Elijah's voice, the way he spoke, that didn't match the situation. A homeless man sitting in a diner, minding his own business? Number Boone wasn't buying it. He kicked the bag again, this time sending it sliding across the sidewalk. Its contents spilled out, scattered in the rain. An old toothbrush, a crumpled book, a change of clothes, and a small metal box that clattered against the concrete. Elijah's fingers twitched ever so slightly as his eyes tracked the small box. His pulse didn't quicken, but something inside him shifted. He didn't move, didn't give Boone the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, he simply watched as Boone bent down to pick it up, opening the lid with an exaggerated show of indifference. "What's this?" Boone asked, dangling the dog tags from the box, smirking. "Military man, huh? Just another bum who couldn't hack it in civilian life?" Elijah stood then, smoothly, almost as if he hadn't been sitting at all. His posture was still, disciplined, too disciplined for a man living on the streets. He didn't say a word, but his eyes locked onto Boone's, cold and steady. "You should put those back," Elijah said quietly, his voice low but clear. Boone laughed, tossing the tags into a puddle. "Or what, old man? You gonna fight the whole police department?" The words stung in a way Boone didn't understand. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Elijah's eyes flashed with something darker, something lethal. The officers around Boone sensed it too. The younger cop, Reynolds, took an instinctive step back. But Boone wasn't done. Not yet. He jabbed the baton. The rain continued its relentless drumming, a monotonous backdrop to the tension that was building between Elijah and Officer Boone. Elijah remained unmoving, his eyes locked on Boone's with the kind of calm that could unsettle even the most hardened men. Boone, however, was clearly irritated by the stillness, the unflinching stare that never wavered, as if he was nothing more than a passing shadow. The officer's grip on his baton tightened, and a flicker of uncertainty flashed in his eyes. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was the one with power here, wasn't he? "You deaf or just stupid?" Boone sneered again, jabbing his baton into Elijah's ribs. "I said, move along." But Elijah didn't budge. He stood there drenched, his jacket soaked through, his eyes never leaving Boone's face. It was as if Elijah was somewhere else entirely, a place far beyond the reach of this petty confrontation. Boone's irritation grew, his face contorting into a grimace as his patience wore thin. He had seen men react to his taunts, fear, anger, compliance. But Elijah, nothing, just that deadly calm. "Move!" Boone barked again, his voice rising, a clear sign of frustration. But still, nothing from Elijah, not even a twitch. Reynolds, the younger officer, shifted nervously behind Boone, eyeing the situation with growing unease. He had seen this kind of confrontation before, but there was something different about this one, something unsettling about the way Elijah held himself. He wasn't a homeless man, he was something more. It wasn't just the way he stood, it was the way he moved, the precision in his stillness, the intelligence in his eyes. It was the way he carried himself like a man who had been through 1,000 battles and was never afraid to face down the next one. "Let's just search his stuff and move on, Sarge," Reynolds suggested, his voice quieter now, a hint of uncertainty in his tone. But Boone wasn't ready to let it go. His pride wouldn't let him. With a sudden jerk, Boone kicked Elijah's bag again, sending it skidding across the wet pavement. The contents scattered further, and this time, the bag itself rolled into the gutter, as if it had no place in the world. The metal box that had slipped free of the bag now lay at Boone's feet, the dog tag still hanging loosely from his hand. He bent down, scoffing at the sight of the old worn tags. "What's this? Some old war hero who couldn't make it in civilian life?" Boone muttered to himself as he let the tags dangle before Elijah's face. His voice dripped with mockery. "You were somebody once, huh? Now you're just another street rat. Pathetic." Something flickered in Elijah's eyes at that. Something dangerous. It was like a spark igniting in a sea of ice. His hands didn't move, but his body, taut and poised, was ready for action. His voice was low but steady as he spoke, each word carrying a weight that made Boone pause for the briefest of moments. "You should put those back." The words, simple as they were, had an unsettling edge to them. Boone's grip on the baton tightened again, but this time there was hesitation in his eyes. He was used to throwing his weight around, bullying people into submission, but Elijah wasn't bending. "What's it gonna be, old man?" Boone laughed, his voice grating in the silence of the street. He dropped the dog tags into the puddle at his feet with deliberate slowness, as though to provoke Elijah further. "Are you gonna cry now? Beg me not to ruin your little keepsakes." A flash of something cold crossed Elijah's face, a shadow of the man he used to be. His gaze was laser-focused, unblinking, as if calculating every potential outcome. Boone laughed again, but this time there was less conviction in it. The younger officers behind him stood still, unsure of how to proceed. Reynolds' eyes flicked nervously from Boone to Elijah, sensing that things were teetering on the edge of something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Without warning, Boone shoved the baton forward, prodding Elijah's chest again. "I said move along!" His voice was laced with venom now, the power he believed he held over the situation slipping away with each passing second. But Elijah didn't react. His body remained rigid, his gaze unwavering, his posture as disciplined as ever. It was as if the world around him had disappeared, and all that mattered was this moment when his patience, his restraint had worn thin. "I'm not bothering anyone," Elijah said, his voice almost too calm. "You're the one bothering me." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Boone faltered. He had expected anger. He had expected fear. What he didn't expect was the quiet, unshakable resolve of a man who had been to hell and back, and who wasn't afraid of facing it again. Reynolds stepped back instinctively, his gaze now fixed on Boone. He could feel the tension building between them, the clash of wills, but he had no idea what to do. His gut told him to step in, to de-escalate, but something about the situation made him hesitant. Something about Elijah made him uneasy. This man wasn't just a homeless veteran. He was a trained predator, someone who had learned to survive, and survive with a vengeance. Boone, however, wasn't about to back down. He jabbed the baton harder into Elijah's chest, his patience breaking. He wanted Elijah to react, to give him an excuse, something to justify escalating the situation. But instead, Elijah simply stood there, his expression unreadable. The stillness was unnerving. "You deaf again?" Boone spat, growing more frustrated. "You're not going to just stand there and take this, are you?" But Elijah still did not respond. The predator inside him was calculating every move, every option. He wasn't afraid of Boone. He wasn't afraid of anything anymore. "You want to fight the whole police department?" Boone taunted, but there was a flicker of doubt in his voice now. He had pushed too far. He knew it, but his pride wouldn't let him turn back. Elijah's lips parted slightly, and the air between them felt charged. The quiet was deafening, like a tension that was building toward an inevitable climax. And then, in a voice so calm it seemed almost detached, Elijah spoke again. "I'm not here to fight you." His eyes narrowed slightly. "But you just made the worst mistake of your life." Before Boone could react, the world shifted. Elijah moved with the precision of someone who had spent his life in combat. It was too fast for Boone to process, too quick for his mind to catch up. One moment, Boone had his hand on Elijah's arm. The next, he was stumbling backward, his footing lost, thrown off balance by the fluid motion of Elijah's body. Elijah didn't move quickly, but he moved with purpose. Every motion was calculated, fluid, and in the blink of an eye, the baton that Boone had relied on so heavily was out of his hand. The predator had awoken, And now Boone and his squad were about to learn the price of underestimating the man they thought was just another homeless veteran. Boone's mind raced as he stumbled backward, his feet unable to keep up with the sudden shift in momentum. His baton, which had seemed like such an intimidating weapon only moments before, was now useless in Elijah's hands. He reached for his sidearm, but before he could even draw it, Elijah was already on him. It was like a blur of motion, too fast, too precise. Boone had been in enough street brawls and skirmishes to know the signs of someone who could fight. But this was different. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution. Elijah's hand shot out, grabbing Boone's wrist with the kind of strength that seemed impossible for someone his age and in his condition. Boone's eyes widened as Elijah twisted his arm, forcing him to drop the baton. The younger officer, Reynolds, watched in stunned silence, his heart racing as the scene unfolded. He had always assumed Elijah was just a sad, forgotten soul, a man who had long since lost his edge. But now he saw the truth. Elijah Carter was no ordinary man. "Don't do it," Reynolds muttered under his breath, though his voice shook with uncertainty. He knew something terrible was happening here, but he couldn't take his eyes off the way Elijah moved, like a predator cornering its prey. Boone wasn't prepared for any of this. He was used to being in control, used to intimidating people with his badge, his authority. But now it was clear that all his bravado had been nothing more than a mask. Elijah's grip tightened, and he shoved Boone back against the rain-soaked pavement. There was no rage in his actions, just cold, calculated efficiency. Elijah knew how to hurt a man without leaving a mark, how to break a spirit without raising his voice, and Boone was feeling that now. "You should have left me alone," Elijah said, his voice steady, almost regretful, as though he were apologizing for something that had to be done. He didn't even look down at Boone, just keeping his gaze locked on the three other officers who had backed away, unsure of what to do next. The younger officer, Reynolds, glanced over at his colleagues, seeking some kind of direction, but they were all just standing there, rooted to the spot by the sheer force of the moment. They had seen tough guys before, bullies, criminals, even hardened killers. But this was something else. Elijah wasn't just a man, he was a force of nature, something that couldn't be reasoned with. One of the officers, who was a bit older and perhaps more experienced, seemed to snap out of his stupor and took a cautious step forward, his hand resting on his gun. "Back off, Carter," he warned, his voice trembling just a little. "You don't know who you're messing with." But Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the officer's warning. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Boone. "You're the one who's messing with me," Elijah muttered, barely above a whisper. And with that, he raised Boone's arm, twisting it just enough to make him yelp in pain. But it wasn't just the physical pain that was breaking Boone. It was the overwhelming realization that he was out of his depth, facing a man who had survived wars, battles, and far worse than anything the streets of New York could throw at him. The rain intensified, as if to underscore the gravity of the moment. The streets, once filled with the noise of the city, now seemed eerily silent. Elijah could feel the weight of the eyes on him, Reynolds, his fellow officers, waiting for him to make his move, to decide whether or not he was going to break this man completely. Elijah let Boone drop to his knees. He could feel the officer's fear radiating off him, could see the uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't just afraid of the physical pain anymore. No, Boone was terrified of what Elijah might do next, of what he had become, a man who had lived through the worst humanity could offer, and yet still came out unbroken. Reynolds finally found his voice, though it came out shaky and unsure. "Sarge, we can't just..." "Shut up," Boone hissed, trying to regain some semblance of authority, but his voice was weak, breaking as he spoke. The fear in his voice was unmistakable. Elijah didn't respond to Reynolds. And he didn't acknowledge Boone's outburst either. Instead, he turned to face the other officers. His movements were deliberate, controlled, each step calculated as though the outcome was already decided. "You don't want to be here when this is over," Elijah said, his tone cold, unfeeling. "Walk away now." The officers hesitated. The younger one, who had been standing on the sidelines, glanced nervously between Elijah and Boone, his hand hovering near his holster, but his fingers trembled. He didn't want to make a move. Not now. Not with the way Elijah was looking at them, like a wolf sizing up its next meal. Boone, struggling to regain control of the situation, finally spat, his face contorting in anger. "You're making a mistake, Carter. You think you can get away with this?" His words were weak, as if he were trying to convince himself that Elijah wasn't the kind of man who would leave him for dead in an alleyway. But Elijah was already done with him. He turned his back on Boone, his focus shifting to the officers still standing in his path. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper, one that carried an unmistakable finality. "I'm not the one making mistakes here, officer." Without another word, Elijah walked away, his steps steady and purposeful, leaving the broken officer behind. The rain soaked through his jacket, but he didn't care. He was done being the hunted. The predator had been awakened, and now the real hunt was just beginning. Behind him, the officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next, their world turned upside down by the man they had just tried to humiliate. But Elijah wasn't worried about them. His mind was already calculating his next move. The game had changed, and he was no longer the one hiding in the shadows. Now he was the one in control. Elijah didn't look back as he walked away from the stunned officers. The streets of New York were still alive with the usual late-night hum, the distant honking of horns, the muffled chatter of pedestrians, the hiss of rain against the pavement. But for Elijah, the city felt different now. There was a weight to the air, a quiet charge as if everything had shifted in an instant. The predator had emerged from the shadows, and nothing would be the same. His mind was already calculating his next move, dissecting the night like he had done so many times before in his military days. He knew Langston's empire would eventually come after him for what had just happened. After all, Elijah had made a very public statement tonight, but for now it didn't matter. He wasn't just reacting anymore, he was controlling the game, and as long as he kept control, he could outmaneuver them. The first step was to disappear again, into the underground network that Langston and his people would never think to search. Elijah had a few old contacts, people who owed him favors, people who had been part of his past life, the life he was trying to leave behind. They would help him get what he needed, weapons, intel, safe houses, whatever it took. But first he needed to get off the street. The rain had started to slow down, the heavy clouds parting, enough for the faintest glow of moonlight to creep through. The city felt emptier now, the streets reflecting back the light like forgotten memories. Elijah found a small alley that led to an old building. He had once spent a few nights in a forgotten corner of this building when things were quieter. He knew the place like the back of his hand. Inside, he made his way through the back door, through a broken hallway that smelled of damp wood and rust. The building was empty, save for the occasional squatter who'd taken refuge. But it was just what he needed, a safe spot to plan. As he stepped into the darkened room, the faint flicker of a fluorescent light buzzed above. It wasn't much, but it would do. Elijah sat down against the wall, letting the stillness settle around him. His fingers touched the small metal box that had once contained his dog tags. He didn't need them anymore. His identity was already erased. But the photo of his old team, crumpled and faded, that was something he couldn't part with. It reminded him of what he used to be and who he was now. He slid the photo back into the box, closed the lid, and set it aside. His mind drifted for a moment. He thought about Boone. That arrogant cop didn't know what he had unleashed tonight. But it wasn't just about Boone. It was about Langston and the empire he had built, a sprawling network that had its hands in everything: drugs, arms dealing, human trafficking. They were untouchable, and for years Elijah had been one of the tools used to keep them in check. But tonight, that had all changed. Tonight, Elijah had stepped out of the shadows, and nothing would ever be the same. The phone in his pocket buzzed, breaking his thoughts. He pulled it out, checking the number before answering. "Carter?" the voice on the other end said, the coldness of authority clear in the tone. Elijah's gaze hardened. He recognized the voice. Colonel Briggs, a man who knew him well from their days in the field, and a man who had once been an ally. Now Briggs was on the other side of the war Elijah had left behind. "Are you ready?" Briggs asked, a hint of curiosity mixed with caution. Elijah stood up slowly, his eyes scanning the room one last time. The building, like everything else in his life, was a temporary stop. It was time to move on. "Yeah," Elijah replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm ready." Briggs sighed, the sound of paper shuffling in the background. "Langston's people are already looking for you. You've started something, and they won't stop until they find you. It's bigger than just him, Carter. This is going to get messy." Elijah's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's already messy, Colonel, but I'm not running anymore. This time I'm coming for them." The line went silent for a moment. Briggs knew exactly what Elijah meant. There were no more shadows to hide in, no more time to waste. Langston's empire had to fall, and Elijah, with his experience and precision, was the one who would bring it down. "Then we'll make it happen," Briggs finally said. "But you need to be careful. Langston is a lot more powerful than you think. You're not the only one he's got watching the city." "I know," Elijah replied, his voice low and deliberate. "But I've got my own people too. I won't be alone in this." The call ended with a quiet click. Elijah slipped the phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath. His plan was already forming in his mind, each step laid out with military precision. But for now, it was about survival. It was about staying one step ahead of Langston's people, making sure they never saw him coming. As he turned to leave the room, the faintest sounds of sirens echoed in the distance, a reminder that the city was waking up to a storm. But it was the calm before the storm for Elijah Carter. The predator was no longer hiding in the shadows. He was on the hunt, and this time, there would be no running. Elijah moved quickly through the city's winding back alleys, blending seamlessly with the shadows as he navigated his way to his next destination. The cold night air bitted his skin, but it didn't matter. The rain had stopped, but the threat of what was to come hung in the air, thick as the fog that started to creep over the streets. He was no longer the hunted. The tables had turned, and now it was Langston and his empire that needed to worry. Elijah's mind raced as he mentally mapped out his plan. Langston wasn't just any criminal. He was a ruthless kingpin with a vast network of corruption, running everything from illegal arms deals to human trafficking. But it wasn't just the empire that Elijah wanted to dismantle. It was the man at the top. Victor Langston was the heart of it all, a shadowy figure who had been operating just under the radar for years, protected by money and power that no one dared challenge. And that was where Elijah came in. The first step was always gathering intel, something Elijah had done better than anyone in his field. He knew the ins and outs of Langston's operation, who was connected, who had access, and more importantly, who was vulnerable. It was time to start pulling the threads. The game had changed, and it was now his turn to dictate the rules. He reached an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Once an abandoned storage facility, it now served as the base of operations for some of Langston's more discreet business dealings. The entrance was guarded, but Elijah had learned long ago how to navigate these kinds of places. There was a back door, hidden in plain sight, and it was his ticket inside. He crept through the shadows, his boots light on the wet pavement, barely making a sound as he approached the building. The guards at the front were oblivious, their attention fixed on the front entrance, unaware of the man who had already bypassed their defenses. Elijah moved through the narrow corridor at the back of the warehouse, his sharp eyes scanning for any signs of movement. This was his world, one of darkness, precision, and patience. Inside, the warehouse was quiet, too quiet. It smelled of old metal and decay, the remnants of long-forgotten goods stacked haphazardly in rows. Elijah moved deeper into the space, his hand brushing against a stack of crates as he moved swiftly yet silently. His training had taught him that in these moments, stillness was just as dangerous as speed. He needed to be unnoticed. The warehouse was large, filled with hidden rooms and passageways. It would take him time to find what he was looking for, but he had time. Time to think, time to act. He found a small office tucked away in a corner of the warehouse. The door was locked, but it wouldn't stop him. A simple lock-picking tool from his bag, and he was inside. The office was sparse. No fancy furniture or decoration, just a desk cluttered with papers, some documents, and a safe on the far wall. Elijah moved quickly, pulling the files from the desk and scanning them for anything useful. Most were nothing but mundane records, transaction logs, and personal notes, but one folder caught his attention. It was labeled in red ink, Operations Port Facility. That was Langston's hub, the central point for all of his trafficking operations. The file contained detailed plans about shipments, locations, and dates. There was also a note detailing an upcoming transfer of merchandise through Langston's port facility. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he flipped through the papers. Children. He saw the words cargo and processing linked with the shipment, and a cold wave of anger washed over him. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about lives being destroyed by the same man he was hunting. Elijah ripped the folder out of the binder and tucked it under his jacket. This was the leverage he needed. He had the proof, the final piece of the puzzle. Langston's empire, built on lies and blood, was about to come crashing down. But first, he needed to get out. The guards were still patrolling outside, and now he had to make his exit before anyone noticed him. Just as he started to head for the back door, a sound broke through the silence, the unmistakable clink of a weapon being drawn. One of the guards had entered the warehouse and was slowly making his way down the corridor. Elijah froze, his heart rate steady but his mind racing. He couldn't afford to be caught here. Not now, not when everything was so close. He moved swiftly, sliding into the shadows, his body pressed against the cold concrete wall. The guard's footsteps grew louder, but Elijah stayed perfectly still, waiting for the right moment. When the guard was just a few feet away, Elijah struck. His hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing the guard's wrist in a vice-like grip. The man didn't have time to react as Elijah twisted the gun from his hand, turning him around and slamming him against the wall with a thud. The guard let out a yelp of surprise, but it was quickly silenced as Elijah knocked him out with a quick, efficient blow to the temple. Elijah quickly stripped the guard of his radio and weapon, making sure to silence the walkie-talkie before slipping it into his bag. There was no time for mistakes. He knew Langston's men would be looking for him, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. But Elijah wasn't going to let them find him first. He moved with purpose toward the exit, the weight of the file heavy in his jacket. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating the next steps. He had the proof now, the final piece of the puzzle. Langston would no longer be able to hide. The hunt was over, and Elijah was ready to bring the empire down. As he stepped into the night, disappearing into the shadows once again, Elijah knew this was only the beginning. The next phase of his mission was already in motion. Langston would pay for what he had done, and Elijah would be the one to make sure of it. It was time to end this, for good. Elijah didn't look back as he disappeared into the night. The shadows swallowed him whole, his form blending into the dark corners of the city like it always had. The distant hum of traffic was the only thing that reminded him the world continued to turn, but in his world, everything had slowed to a calculated crawl. His mission was clear. Langston's empire would crumble, and no one, not even the man at the top, would escape. But the path ahead wasn't going to be easy. Every step was a delicate calculation. He made his way through the city's winding streets, his thoughts focused on the file he had just acquired. Langston's port operation was the nerve center of his entire criminal network. The shipment detailed in the file, a transfer of young children to an undisclosed location, was proof of the monster Langston had become. It was the tipping point. Elijah wasn't just hunting a criminal kingpin anymore. He was hunting a human trafficker who had masked his crimes under layers of legitimacy and wealth. No amount of money or power could redeem him. Langston had to fall. Elijah's plan was simple: take down Langston's entire operation, dismantle it piece by piece, and expose the darkness for the world to see. But it wasn't just the criminals that needed to be taken down. There were those who hid in the shadows, pulling strings from the sidelines. Politicians, businessmen, corrupt officials who had protected Langston for years. Elijah was going to make sure that the entire house of cards came crashing down. The first step, however, was to get the evidence into the right hands. He had to make sure that someone in authority, could get the message to the right people. He needed to get the file to the FBI. The information inside it was damning. With the right people involved, it could be the nail in Langston's coffin. But time was running out. He couldn't afford to wait too long. The streets were dark and empty as Elijah walked toward the small apartment building that housed his old contact, a former journalist who had lost everything when he tried to take down corrupt officials years ago. Elijah had worked with him before, a man who knew how to play the game and get information out when the stakes were high. This time, however, it wasn't just information, it was justice. As Elijah approached the building, he kept to the shadows. His senses were alert, and every noise felt like a threat. He knew that Langston's men were still hunting for him, and they would do anything to silence him. But Elijah wasn't easy to catch. He had spent too many years perfecting the art of disappearing, of becoming a ghost in a city that never slept. He slipped inside the building without making a sound, heading straight for the apartment on the top floor. His contact, Greg, had been the one to tell him about Langston's operation years ago. Greg had paid the price for his attempt to expose it, but now he was the one Elijah needed. When Elijah knocked, it was soft, deliberate. A moment later, the door opened, revealing Greg, a man with the weariness of someone who had seen too much. His eyes flickered with recognition when he saw Elijah standing in front of him. "Elijah," Greg said, his voice low, "thought you disappeared for good. What are you doing here?" "I need your help," Elijah replied, his voice steady. He handed Greg the file without hesitation. "Everything you need to bring Langston down is in there." Greg hesitated, glancing down at the folder. "You're sure about this? This is bigger than you think. Langston's connected to everything: politics, business, law enforcement. If you go after him, you'll bring the whole system down with you." Elijah's eyes narrowed. He had made his choice long ago. The system that had allowed monsters like Langston to thrive was broken. Then it's time for the system to change. Greg looked at Elijah for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll get this to the right people. But you need to lay low. Langston's going to come after you. And when they do, they won't stop." "I know." Elijah's voice was like steel. "But I'm not done yet." With that, Greg closed the door, and Elijah stood in the hallway, watching the shadows dance across the walls. The next phase of the plan was set into motion, but the real challenge was still ahead. Langston wouldn't go down easily. No, he'd fight until the bitter end. But Elijah had never been one to back down from a fight. As he turned to leave, a cold sense of finality washed over him. The game was far from over. He was no longer just fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves, the children who had been sold into slavery, the families torn apart by Langston's empire. Every life lost, every broken soul, added fuel to the fire that was burning inside him. Elijah's steps were quick and decisive as he made his way back to the alley that led out of the building. His mind was already working, planning his next move. Langston had enemies, plenty of them, and Elijah would use that to his advantage. The empire that Langston had so carefully built was built on lies and blood. It was time to take it apart, piece by piece. But just as Elijah turned the corner, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up behind him. He didn't need to look back to know who it was. The headlights of a black SUV illuminated the street, and Elijah's instincts screamed at him to move. Before he could react, the door of the SUV opened and a man stepped out. Marcus Weiss, Langston's right-hand mercenary, a man Elijah knew all too well. Weiss had been in the business for years. He was dangerous, ruthless, and, like Elijah, a trained killer. But Elijah wasn't about to let Weiss be the one to take him down. Not tonight. With a quick turn, Elijah disappeared into the shadows, the night swallowing him whole. The chase was on, but this time, it wouldn't be Weiss who came out on top. Elijah was done hiding. The hunter had become the hunted, and he wasn't going to stop until Langston's world came crashing down. It was game on. Elijah's pulse quickened as he ducked into another narrow alley, the familiar sound of boots on concrete echoing just behind him. Weiss and his men were getting closer, but Elijah wasn't concerned. He was used to being pursued, used to the chase. It wasn't the first time he'd been hunted, and it wouldn't be the last. But tonight the stakes were higher. His plan had already set the wheels in motion, and there was no turning back now. Langston had made a grave mistake thinking Elijah was just another casualty of the streets. The alley twisted sharply ahead, leading to a dead end with a rusty metal gate that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Elijah didn't hesitate. He bolted toward it, climbing over the gate with a fluid motion that would have been impossible for most. Once on the other side, he turned to face his pursuers, crouching low behind a stack of discarded crates. The sound of the SUV's engine revving grew louder as it turned the corner into the alley. Elijah could hear Weiss barking orders, his voice sharp and demanding. "Split up!" "He's here somewhere," Weiss commanded. Elijah's eyes scanned the alley ahead, calculating his next move. He knew Weiss wouldn't give up easily, but Elijah wasn't going to make it easy for him. The trick was making sure Weiss thought he was still in the alley. While the mercenaries spread out, Elijah slipped further into the shadows, using his knowledge of the city to his advantage. He could hear the faint sound of footsteps getting closer as one of the mercenaries approached. Elijah moved quickly, silently, and with a single movement, he grabbed the man by the throat, twisting him around so he was facing the wrong direction. With a swift blow to the neck, the mercenary collapsed, unconscious, before he even hit the ground. Elijah didn't pause. He didn't have time for any distractions. The other mercenaries would be right behind. Elijah crept along the wall, his senses heightened, every sound, every movement in the shadows feeding his next step. He needed to buy himself time. It was all about the long game now. Langston had underestimated him, and that was a mistake he wouldn't make again. A flash of movement caught his eye, and he paused, his body perfectly still. Weiss and two other mercenaries rounded the corner, moving fast, their weapons ready. Elijah's eyes narrowed as he calculated their positions. There were too many of them to engage head-on, not without risking exposure. He waited until they were just within range, then made his move. He darted across the alley, closing the distance between himself and Weiss with calculated precision. As he passed behind one of the mercenaries, he struck, 2 quick blows to the back of the man's head, knocking him out cold. Weiss spun around just in time to see Elijah disappear into the shadows again. his figure melding seamlessly with the night. "Where the hell did he go?" Weiss shouted, frustration seeping into his voice. "He's too fast," another mercenary shouted in response, clearly rattled by the speed and precision of Elijah's attack. Elijah stayed quiet, letting the tension build. They were hunting him, but they were also falling right into his trap. Every movement was calculated to give them just enough hope to make them feel they were closing in. But in reality, Elijah was always one step ahead. He could hear the sound of Weiss barking orders, the mercenaries moving cautiously, their steps echoing in the alley as they searched for him. Elijah stayed still, waiting for the perfect moment. Then, just as the last mercenary passed by his position, he sprang into action. With lightning speed, Elijah leapt out from behind the crates, knocking the mercenary's weapon out of his hands before he even knew what was happening. A quick jab to the man's throat and a twist of the arm, and he was on the ground, incapacitated in seconds. Weiss, seeing the last of his team fall, turned and fled, knowing full well that Elijah wasn't a man to be cornered. But as Weiss started running, Elijah moved fast, closing the gap between them. He wouldn't let Weiss escape, not when he had the information he needed. The mercenary was fast, but Elijah was faster. And just as Weiss reached the alley's exit, Elijah was on him, knocking him down to the wet pavement in one swift motion. "Weiss," Elijah said, his voice cold as he hovered over the mercenary. "You're not going anywhere." Weiss groaned, trying to push himself up, but Elijah's knee pressed hard into his back, keeping him pinned. "You don't get to run this time." Elijah leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "You tell Langston, his empire's coming down. You're going to make sure he knows this. I'll be the one who puts him in the ground." Weiss looked up at him, fear flashing in his eyes. He was no stranger to danger, but this was different. He wasn't dealing with a regular soldier or an amateur. He was dealing with Elijah Carter, the most lethal man in the world. Elijah's eyes were dark, filled with a cold resolve. "You'll tell him, or you'll never see another sunrise." Weiss swallowed hard, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he tried to gather his composure. There was nothing he could say, no bargaining left. Elijah wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to end Langston's reign. After a long, tense moment, Weiss finally nodded, his lips trembling. "Good," Elijah said, releasing him and stepping back. "Now get up. Get out of here." Weiss scrambled to his feet, glaring at Elijah with hatred in his eyes. He knew there was no way out of this. Elijah had already sealed his fate. As he staggered away, Elijah stood in the shadows, watching him go. He could feel the shift in the air, the calm before the storm. Langston's empire was finally beginning to crack. It was only a matter of time before everything fell apart, and Elijah would be the one to make sure it did. The endgame was approaching, and Elijah was ready to finish what he had started. Elijah stood in the shadows, his chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. The rain had started again, falling in light sheets, but it didn't matter. He was used to the cold, to the weight of the city pressing down on him. Langston's empire was crumbling, piece by piece, and Elijah was the one pulling the strings. He watched as Weiss disappeared into the night, a part of him knowing that the mercenary would report back to Langston. The boss would find out soon enough that Elijah was coming for him, but Elijah didn't care. Langston was just another target, another enemy to bring down. He had survived wars, traps, and betrayals for far too long. Now he was in control, and Langston's days were numbered. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out. The message was brief. "Langston's meeting is set. They're all there tonight." It wasn't much, but it was enough. Elijah knew that tonight was the night to strike. Langston had a meeting with his top lieutenants, a final gathering to regroup and plan their next steps. It was the perfect opportunity to infiltrate, the kind of opportunity Elijah had been waiting for. Elijah's fingers clenched around the phone. He could feel the tension building within him, but his expression remained neutral. He didn't let emotions rule his actions. Not anymore. His training had taught him how to suppress everything. Anger, fear, regret. All of it was buried beneath the surface. Tonight, he was a machine, a weapon. The location was a mansion on the outskirts of the city, a heavily guarded compound. Langston had always been paranoid about his safety, but that wouldn't stop Elijah. He had already scouted the place, mapped it out in his mind, and planned every step of the way. There was no way Langston would escape tonight. Elijah pulled his jacket tighter around him, his mind already racing through the details. He needed to be precise, methodical. There was no room for error. The mansion was surrounded by high walls, but Elijah had a way in, a small access gate he had scouted out earlier. From there, he would make his way to the heart of the compound, the main room where Langston and his men were holed up. As he moved through the dark streets, Elijah's thoughts turned to Reynolds, the rookie cop who had been forced into this world of corruption and violence. Elijah knew the man had made his choice. There was no going back for him now, but Reynolds was still a loose end. Elijah didn't trust anyone, not completely, and he didn't know whether the rookie would be a help or a hindrance in the final moments. But one thing was certain: if Langston had any hope of survival, it would be because of someone like Reynolds, someone willing to play dirty to stay alive. Elijah wasn't sure he could afford that, but the thought was fleeting. He couldn't afford distractions now. Tonight wasn't about Reynolds, it was about Langston. He arrived at the compound just after midnight, the sky above him dark and thick with clouds. He stayed low as he approached the access gate, the quiet of the night making every step seem louder than it was. He could hear the muffled voices of guards in the distance, but they weren't paying attention to the small corner of the fence where he had slipped through before. The gate was easy to open, just as he had expected. With a single fluid motion, Elijah slipped through into the compound. His heart rate was steady, his body moving with the quiet precision of a predator on the hunt. The guards stationed along the perimeter wouldn't hear him. They wouldn't see him coming. Elijah was the ghost in the night. He crept forward, avoiding the main patrols as he made his way toward the mansion. His hand was steady as he reached into his bag, pulling out the silenced pistol he had taken from one of Langston's men earlier. The weight of it was familiar. He didn't need a rifle tonight, not when he was so close. A pistol was all he needed to finish this. To end Langston's reign of terror. The mansion loomed in front of him, its grand exterior hiding the rot inside. Elijah moved toward a side entrance, one that led to a series of stairwells and hallways that could take him directly to the main room where Langston and his men were waiting. The plan was simple: get in, eliminate the men closest to Langston, and then make his move. He reached the door, slipping inside and into the darkness of the hallway. His senses heightened as he moved through the mansion, every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of air, registering in his mind. The guards were few, but they were dangerous. He couldn't underestimate them. They were still loyal to Langston. He knew that much. But Elijah wasn't afraid. He had taken down better men than these. As he neared the door to the main room, he paused for a moment. He could hear the voices inside, muffled but distinct. Langston was in there. This was it, the final step. His breath evened out, and his fingers tightened around the handle of the gun. It was time. He opened the door, moving swiftly, silently into the room. The first two guards didn't even see him coming. A quick shot to the temple. Both men dropped before they could make a sound. The room fell into chaos. The rest of Langston's men reacted quickly, but not quickly enough. Elijah was already on them, his body moving like a blur, his gun firing with perfect precision. The fight didn't last long. Langston's men were good, but they weren't good enough. Elijah moved like a machine, taking down every man in the room with brutal efficiency. There were no second chances, no mercy. And then Elijah's eyes landed on Langston, the man who had built his empire on blood, on lies, on the suffering of others. He was standing at the back of the room, his hand reaching for a gun. But Elijah was faster. In a single movement, Elijah raised his pistol, aiming straight for Langston. "Game over," Elijah said, his voice cold and final. Langston froze, his eyes wide with fear. For the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. Elijah squeezed the trigger, and everything Langston had built came to an end in an instant. Langston collapsed, his body hitting the floor with a dull thud. The echo of the gunshot still hung in the air, vibrating through the grand room like a tremor. Elijah stood over him, his chest rising and falling slowly, as if the weight of the moment was finally sinking in. He had done it. He had taken down the man who had controlled so many lives for so long. But even in the silence that followed, Elijah knew this wasn't just about one man. It was about the empire, the system, the people who had allowed it all to continue. For a moment, the room was still, frozen in time. Langston's blood was slowly staining the marble floor, and his men lay scattered across the room, their fates sealed by the hand of the one man they had underestimated. Elijah, the ghost, had come to collect his dues. His eyes flickered around the room, scanning for any remaining threats. But it was clear, Langston's reign was over. The system he had built was crumbling around him. Elijah didn't need to stay any longer. His mission was complete. He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the now quiet room. As he made his way through the mansion, a weight seemed to lift off his shoulders. But it wasn't peace that replaced it. There was still the aftermath, still the realization that this was only one part of a much bigger, darker war. Langston may have been taken down, but the corruption, the web of criminal enterprises, politicians, and powerful figures remained intact. The world Elijah had stepped back into was still full of shadows, and there would always be more work to do. Reaching the back door of the mansion, Elijah paused for a moment, looking out at the darkened skyline of New York. The city never slept. It was always moving, always changing. But for a brief moment, Elijah felt a rare sense of finality. He had won this round, but there would be more battles to come. The war was far from over. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, checking the message. It was from Greg, his old contact, the one who had helped him get the evidence to the right hands. "It's done. The feds have everything. Langston's empire is exposed. You did it, Elijah. You took them down." Elijah didn't reply right away. He wasn't sure there was anything more to say. The truth was out there now, and it would never be hidden again. Langston's operations would be dismantled, one by one, and those who had protected him would face the consequences. Elijah had given them a chance to redeem themselves by doing what was right. The ball was in their court now. He slid the phone back into his jacket pocket and began walking down the long, empty street. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and the city's exhaust fumes. He didn't mind. The cold felt grounding, sharp against his skin. It reminded him that there was still more to do, more steps to take in the fight for justice. As Elijah walked, he passed a street corner where a group of homeless people huddled together for warmth. One of them caught his eye, an old man with a tattered coat, staring at the sky as if he were waiting for something. A wave of recognition passed through Elijah. It was almost like looking in a mirror, a reminder of the man he used to be, before everything, before the government, before the killing. A part of him wanted to stop, to help, to somehow offer a hand to those who had been left behind by society. But he knew better. He couldn't afford distractions. He had his mission, and that mission was far from finished. But for a fleeting moment, Elijah paused. He was more than just a weapon. He was a man, carrying the weight of so many others on his shoulders, trying to do what was right in a world that often didn't care. Shaking the thought away, Elijah continued on. He didn't know where he was going next. Maybe back into hiding, maybe to take down the next target. But he did know one thing. He wouldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Because when you've been broken, rebuilt, and turned into a weapon, you don't just fight for yourself. You fight for the ones who can't fight. You fight to change the system, to bring down the corrupt. And when the last man falls, when the dust settles, you'll know that, at least for a while, the world is just a little bit better. And that was enough. Elijah Carter disappeared into the night like a shadow, a ghost. But his fight was far from over. The war was still waiting,